Hi guys, Jamie from Boxing Life and welcome back to the channel. I just wanted to do a video today on a recent interview which Gennady Golovkin was in with a guy called Chris Shiflett. I think that's how you say his second name. And he was a guitarist, or is a guitarist, in the band the Foo Fighters, if you've ever heard of them. And he's got his own podcast called Walking the Floor. Quite a random podcast, if you ask me, for Golovkin to go on, but he clearly knows him from LA, as he does live out there. So, but regardless, it was a good interview in terms of he asked, some pretty open questions. Maybe some guys would be scared to ask. But yeah, he was quite more open, it was quite an open interview. There is an interpreter in this podcast, translating for Triple G, but it's still interesting regardless, and I'll leave it in the description below for you guys to check out in full. But I just wanted to address some of the key points in this podcast, which he kind of brought up, and I'll just start off with his upcoming fight with Murata. And Chris basically asked him, if he knows much about him or if he's doing like analysis on him. And I just thought it was interesting that Golovkin said he used to train with Morata and he's also sparred him. So he seemed pretty confident around the fact that he didn't need to really look too much into him, in particular when he was saying that to Chris. And he just talked about how they have two kind of different approaches and how the fight might actually be unpredictable because it's in Japan. Now, but I think maybe, he is a bit more cautious and about the business of boxing now after the Canelo fights. Maybe that's why he said the word unpredictable, because now he doesn't really trust or believe in the boxing systems that are around the world now, I guess. That's my interpretation of it, and in terms of what he said in this interview. But interesting as well, he also compared, he didn't say who it would be, which I thought was interesting, but he basically said that the fight, will be respectful, but it could be compared to a wild animal being in a corner, and the animal being very unpredictable, which I thought was interesting. And he didn't, Chris actually pushed him on who he thought, and he didn't answer the question. There is also the element of obviously Golovkin being out the ring for quite a while now, but so is Murata, so maybe he's making sense. As they are both aging fighters, it could be unpredictable at times for both guys, as they don't really know how they're going to be when they get back in there. So I just thought that was quite an interesting take from Golovkin in terms of, the upcoming fight in April. And I guess that kind of leads on to the next question around, Chris asking him, if he's still motivated and how he keeps healthy, compared to some of these other fighters that who are at their prime and would be defeated, like Roy Jones Jr. when he lost in his prime. And basically Golovkin was saying, I'm very different to these fighters, and he's got this deep desire. Weirdly, he was comparing his desire to like his thirst for sex. And it was a weird example for him to give, but I do get where he was coming from in terms of, he does have that motivation to just keep fighting, because I think he generally loves the sport. And then Chris kind of led that on to questions about unifying at middleweight. He mentioned the likes of Mongeya, Charlo, and would that be a good option for him to, fight those guys next? And basically, he just said that, he's not gonna start saying anyone's name, because then they'll start using self-promotion for themselves. And the people that he doesn't mention, when he does mention someone, will start even calling him out even louder, which I thought was funny. The first person I thought of was like someone like Chris Eubank Jr. or Andrade or something like that. But then he doesn't want to be in that situation of giving out self-promotion now like he used to maybe in the past. But I didn't even think Golovkin would be that bad for calling people out. He always called out for the Canelo fight, I think, at times, and he used to call it Andrew Ward and Carl Froch, I think, a couple of times, but those fights never materialised, I guess. I just thought it was quite interesting in regards to potentially trying to unify the division instead for the rest of his career. And then finally touched on the Canelo fight, and you can tell he is quite, I guess, sour and bitter about the whole experiences. And you know what, I have to kind of agree with him. I think he was extremely hard done by in that first fight. I think 95% of fans, unless you're a super Canelo fan, you're gonna say Golovkin won that first fight. The second fight was a lot closer, as we all know, and you could arguably make a case for either guy winning that fight. I still think Golovkin did enough in the fight to win, personally, but I can also see how you could give it a draw, or maybe Canelo just edging it. It was a very close fight. It was hard to score as well. For Golovkin anyway, you know, he very much feels like he won the fight. And, you know, he even said, you know, there are people comfortable with being delusional, and I'll let them live being delusional. And you can probably guess who he's targeting that at. Also said, I think I won those two fights and there's no way I'm going to change my mind. There are people happy believing the opposite happened, but I don't care. Yes, the result infuriated me a little, because in those moments it was the biggest in the world. And I have to kind of agree with him in terms of why he would be upset. It's such a huge occasion, and to kind of get let down by the judges on both scorecards, let's be honest. I think he's definitely bitter about the whole situation. He even said how journalists have said how he chased Canelo from the middleweight division, which I thought was interesting. And Chris obviously pushed him on the Canelo fight and said, you know, like, about the third one happening, and, you know, how he is as a fighter. And, you know, Golovkin was quite open about it. You know, he pretty much said that, you know, he has the keys to open up Canelo, and that Canelo also has keys in his arsenal as well, to make it an interesting fight again for the third. We also mentioned, you know, why Canelo didn't really want to fight him, and that was because of the knowledge of Golovkin being able to cause Canelo problems, basically. And I have to kind of agree with Golovkin. You know, in my opinion, you know, there's only been a few fighters that have really caused, you know, Canelo some serious problems. Obviously Mayweather, but that was slightly different style. It was more Canelo couldn't work out Mayweather getting a hold of him. Whereas with Golovkin in particular, the first fight, you know, Canelo was on the back foot for most of that fight. He couldn't get a hold of Golovkin's jab. He was really he struggled against it for the full fight. Second fight, obviously Canelo made the adjustments. He fought in the pocket, whereas Golovkin was a bit more on the back foot, but he was still there with Canelo the whole fight. You know, I think the reason maybe why Canelo just got it was that he stayed in the pocket so well in that fight, and he proved his chin too. But, you know, that is not a pleasant experience for any fighter. You know, you think about who he's gone on to fight since, you know, nothing like Triple G in my opinion. You know, yes, he moved up in weight, but that doesn't necessarily mean these guys are better than Triple G or more dangerous. You know, Golovkin was still a big puncher regardless. And yeah, I think it was quite nice to hear Golovkin be quite open in this interview, and I recommend you guys check it out. I'll leave it in the description below. Let me know about your thoughts about Golovkin taking on Murata. Do you think he should just continue in the middleweight division and pursue the other fights to unify? Personally, I think it'll be a bit of a struggle doing that, if I'm honest, for him. I think he'll, because of the politics and the different networks these guys are on, I just think it's, you know, at this stage in his career, it'll be very hard for him to become unified middleweight champion. Whereas the Canelo fight, there's a lot of money on the table, not just for Golovkin, but also Canelo. And because Golovkin's obviously a lot older now, you know, Canelo could be a lot more willing to take the fight and also close the book in his chapter of people saying he lost both fights. You know, it'll give him the closure that he needs. It's definitely a top 3 hardest fight for Canelo to take is the Golovkin fight. but we really need to see how he is in April against Murata. And like I said in this interview, you know, he was a bit unclear about how that fight will go down, you know, talking about, you know, how it's going to be unpredictable and that how he kind of already knows what Murata's like. There was a sense of confidence in him, but there was also a sense of, I don't know what's going to happen. So yeah, it'll be interesting. But yeah guys, let me know in the comments below. I just thought I'd share this interview. I thought it was quite interesting. And yeah, as always guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.